My golden brother sibling hated me and started following me. Instead, I exposed his darkest secret. I took everything from him. If you've ever lived in a small town, you know it can be either a blessing or a curse. For me, it was mostly the latter. My name's Nate, and I'm the middle child in a family where the golden boy title was permanently reserved for my older brother Brandon. Brandon is 38, 2 years older than me, and the walking definition of suburban mediocrity dressed up as success. He works in real estate, sells overpriced homes to people drowning in debt while acting like he's some Wall Street tycoon. He's got the trophy wife, 2 kids who think life is just one long highlight reel of their sports achievements, and a mortgage he pretends is a badge of honor instead of a financial noose. He also thinks he's my life coach. Spoiler, he's not. My parents? They fit right into the picture. My dad, a retired engineer, is the kind of guy who thinks emotions are for the weak, and that if you're not working 60-hour weeks, you're a failure. My mom, a former elementary school teacher, spent decades molding kids into what society expects them to be. But somehow, she never figured out how to accept me for who I was. In their eyes, I was always the soft one, the kid who wasn't tough, who didn't play sports, who preferred computers over backyard brawls. They never got my asthma, never understood my struggles with depression. To them, if it wasn't something you could see on an X-ray, it wasn't real. I barely scraped by in high school with a 2.5 GPA. Tried college, dropped out in my second year. That sealed the deal. I was officially the family disappointment. Meanwhile, Brandon was riding high, selling houses, flexing about his commissions, bragging about his investments, which mostly involved leasing expensive cars he couldn't actually afford. Every family dinner was just another episode of The Brandon Show, where he paraded his success while treating me like some failed experiment. What he didn't know was that, while he was busy inflating his ego, I was quietly building something real. I started in IT, working in cybersecurity, and eventually co-founded a company with an old friend from my gaming days. We built it from the ground up, and when a larger corporation came knocking, we sold. I walked away with a fat buyout, cash and stock options that set me up for life. But I didn't go flashy with it. No sports cars, no mansions. I live in a solid, comfortable home, drive a 12-year-old Toyota, and keep my money where it grows instead of where it depreciates. And my family? They had no clue. As far as they knew, I was still that awkward kid working at the comic book store that closed down 7 years ago, until Brandon decided to pull a stunt that blew up in his own face. See, my brother is the kind of guy who needs to win, even if no one else is competing. He couldn't stand the idea that I was just quietly existing outside his shadow. So, in his infinite wisdom, he hired a private investigator to dig into my life. I'm guessing he expected to find dirt, maybe proof that I was broke, in trouble, or barely getting by. Something he could use as ammo to reinforce his position as the successful one. Instead, he found out I was richer than him, that I owned property, that I had investments, that I was making more money in a year than he had in the past 5. And the best part, he had paid someone to prove it. There's something uniquely satisfying about watching a man choke on his own arrogance. Not literally, though I wouldn't have minded that either. But seeing Brandon's world tilt as he realized that I, the so-called loser of the family, was leagues ahead of him, that was a kind of justice I never thought I'd get. And yet, there it was, playing out like a slow-motion car, crash right in front of me. The moment of revelation happened at one of those dreadful Sunday dinners, the ones where my parents expected me to endure 3 hours of unsolicited advice, Brandon's financial flexing, and my mother's subtle digs at my lack of a real family. Normally, I would just sit there, chew my food, nod at the appropriate times, and count down the minutes until I could escape. But this time was different. This time, Brandon walked in with a smugness that was almost palpable, rubbing his hands together like a cartoon villain. My gut told me something was up, but I wasn't sure what, until he opened his mouth. "So, Nate," he started, barely hiding his amusement. "Been doing a little freelance work, huh?" I glanced at him over my plate. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, nothing," he said, shrugging dramatically. "Just did a little digging. Wanted to see how my little brother was holding up. You know, since you never really talk about what you do." My mother, always eager to latch onto anything that could reinforce her image of me as a failure, leaned in. "What do you mean, Brandon? What did you find?" He grinned, pulling out a folder. A physical folder. Because, of course, he had to go old school for dramatic effect. He tossed it onto the table, and my father, ever the man of few words, picked it up and started flipping through the pages. My mom peered over his shoulder, her expression slowly twisting into something I couldn't quite place. I kept my face neutral, but inside, I was boiling. Not because I was scared. I knew exactly what was in that file. No, I was pissed because of the sheer audacity. My own brother had hired someone to investigate me, like I was some shady criminal he needed to expose. And for what? To stroke his own fragile ego. Then, something happened that I didn't expect. My father stopped flipping through the papers. He looked up at me, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw something that I never thought I'd see in his eyes. Respect. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice gruffer than usual. "You own all this?" "Yeah," I said simply. "I do." The silence that followed was thick. My mother looked stunned, like someone had just told her that gravity was optional. Brandon, on the other hand, was seething. This was not the reaction he was expecting. He had thought this would be his big moment, his chance to parade my supposed failures in front of our parents and solidify his status as the superior son. But instead, he had handed me the greatest victory of my life on a silver platter. "Well, that's quite something," my father finally said. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Would you have believed me?" More silence. That was answer enough. But Brandon wasn't done yet. He wasn't the type to go down without a fight, and I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as he tried to salvage the situation. "You know," he said, his tone shifting to something almost condescending, "money isn't everything. Just because you made a few good investments doesn't mean you actually have a real career. I mean, what do you even do all day? Sit behind a computer? That's not exactly what I call hard work." I smiled. I actually smiled. Because now I had him. "You're right," I said, leaning back. "I don't work hard. I work smart. That's why I'm not drowning in debt, trying to keep up with a lifestyle I can't afford. That's why I don't have 3 mortgages and a stack of unpaid credit card bills. That's why I don't have the IRS breathing down my neck." The color drained from his face, so fast I thought he might pass out. "What the hell are you talking about?" he snapped. I reached into my own bag and pulled out a folder of my own. Unlike his, mine wasn't filled with half-baked assumptions. No, mine was filled with facts. "You dug into my life, Brandon. It's only fair I return the favor." I slid the file across the table. He didn't take it, so my father did. As he read, his face darkened. My mother gasped. My sister, who had mostly been quiet up until now, muttered a soft, "Jesus Christ." Brandon's voice was a growl. "You had no right." "No right." I cut him off. "You hired a damn investigator to dig into my personal life, Brandon. You wanted to humiliate me, expose me. But all you did was expose yourself." My father slammed the file shut. "Is this true?" Brandon's jaw clenched. "It's not as bad as it looks." "Not as bad." I scoffed. "You have multiple DUIs, a file with Child Protective Services, and you're months behind on your mortgage. You've got loan sharks knocking on your door, and you're maxed out on every credit line you've got. You're a financial disaster, Brandon." And then, the final nail in the coffin. "And you had the nerve to look down on me?" The room exploded. My mother was crying. My father was yelling. My sister was shaking her head, whispering something to her husband. And Brandon was looking at me like he wanted to put his fist through my skull. But I wasn't scared of him anymore. For the first time in my life, I held all the power. And he knew it. Brandon always had a temper, but I had never seen him this close to exploding. His face was beet red, his hands balled into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. The air in the dining room was thick, charged, like the calm before a tornado rips through a town. My father was still holding the file, staring at it like he couldn't believe his own eyes. My mother, hands trembling, had pushed her chair back as if physical distance could somehow shield her from the mess unraveling in front of her. My sister, ever the silent observer, just shook her head, whispering something to her husband. And then Brandon snapped. "You think you're so damn smart, don't you?" His voice was a growl, low but dangerous. "Digging into my personal life? Snooping through my finances? Who the hell do you think you are?" I leaned forward, meeting his glare with an infuriating calm. "I think I'm the guy who just proved you're full of shit." He moved fast. Too fast. 1 second, he was across the table, and the next, he lunged at me, sending dishes flying as he grabbed for my collar. But I was ready. Years of quietly dealing with his bullying, of always being on the receiving end, had prepared me for this moment. I ducked. His fist cut through the air where my face had been a second earlier, and his momentum sent him crashing forward. He slammed into the table, knocking over a glass of wine that spilled across the surface, staining my mother's pristine white tablecloth. "Brandon!" My father barked, his voice a sharp crack of authority. But my brother wasn't listening. He turned on me again, and this time, I didn't back down. He swung, but he was sloppy, driven by anger, not precision. I sidestepped, grabbing his wrist and twisting just enough to throw him off balance. He stumbled, and I used his own momentum to shove him back against the wall. "Enough!" My father's voice thundered through the room. "This is not happening in my house." Brandon, panting wild-eyed, looked from me to our father and back again. Then, in an act of pure, reckless stupidity, he turned his rage onto our parents. "Oh, now you care. Now you're taking his side." He gestured wildly at me, spit flying from his mouth. "The failure son, the one you all pitied? The one who sat at this table for years, while you told him how much better I was? And now, just because he's got some money, suddenly I'm the bad guy." My father's expression was unreadable, but there was something different in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Disappointment. "You did this to yourself, Brandon." Those words hit him harder than any punch ever could. Brandon let out a bitter, humorless laugh. Fine. You want me to be the villain? Congratulations. You got what you wanted." And with that, he stormed out, knocking over a chair on his way. The door slammed so hard the whole house seemed to shake. A thick, suffocating silence followed. My mother looked like she wanted to cry, but no one moved to comfort her. My father just exhaled, long and slow, like he just aged 10 years in a single night. I should have felt victorious. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, all I felt was exhausted. "You should go," my father finally said. I nodded. "Yeah, I think I will." As I grabbed my coat and walked out into the cold night air, one thing became clear. My brother had spent years trying to tear me down, but in the end, he had only destroyed himself. The night air was crisp, biting against my skin as I stepped outside. The world beyond my parents' house was quiet, in stark contrast to the chaos I'd just left behind. My hands were still clenched, my pulse still pounding from a confrontation. But beneath it all, there was something else, a feeling I hadn't expected. Relief. For the first time in my life, I didn't care. I didn't care what Brandon thought of me. I didn't care if my parents finally saw me as something more than a shadow. I didn't care about their approval or their disappointment. I was free. But freedom, as I soon learned, came with its own set of problems. The next morning, I woke up to a barrage of missed calls and text messages. My mother had left 3 voicemails, each one more frantic than the last. My sister had sent a simple, "You need to call me." Now, my father? Radio silence. And then there was the last text. From an unknown number. "You made a mistake, little brother. Hope you're ready for what's coming." Brandon. Of course. He wouldn't take his downfall like a man. He had to turn it into a war. I sighed, rubbing my temples before deleting the message. He wasn't worth my time. I had my own life, my own success, my own peace. If he wanted to keep playing these childish games, let him. But I should have known better. The first strike. That afternoon, I got a call from my job. My boss, David, sounded tense. "Nate, I need you to come in. We need to talk." I frowned. "Everything okay? Just get here." When I arrived, David was waiting for me in his office, a thick file spread out on his desk. He gestured for me to sit, but his expression was grim. "I got an anonymous tip today," he said, sliding the file toward me, "claiming that you've been involved in fraud and corporate espionage, that you've been leaking company data to competitors." I blinked. "What? That's insane. Who the hell?" And then it hit me. "Brandon." David watched my reaction closely. "I don't believe it. But you know how these things work. HR has to investigate. If this gets messy, you could be suspended until we clear it up." My jaw tightened. Brandon wanted a war. Fine. I'd give him one. Retaliation. That night, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I dug. Brandon had skeletons, but I had only scratched the surface before. This time, I wasn't just looking for dirt. I was looking for a way to end this. It didn't take long. A few calls, a few favors pulled, and I had everything I needed. Bank statements, fake business deals, evidence of money laundering through his real estate ventures. It was all there in black and white. He thought he could destroy me with baseless accusations. I had hard, irrefutable proof that could put him behind bars. I stared at the files for a long time, debating my next move. Was I really about to do this? Was I really about to ruin him? And then I thought about the years of humiliation, the constant put-downs, the way he tried to make me feel like nothing. Yes, I was. Checkmate. The next morning, I paid a visit to an old friend, an investigative journalist named Sam. I handed over the files with a single instruction. Make sure the right people see this. The fallout was swift. By the end of the week, Brandon's name was plastered all over the news. His company went under investigation. His assets were frozen. His cushy life, built on lies and fraud, came crumbling down like a house of cards. And me, I slept like a baby. The dust hadn't even settled before the real storm began. Brandon was out for blood. I knew it the moment I saw his face on the news, leaving his office as reporters swarmed him like vultures. He looked like a man teetering on the edge, jaw clenched, fists tight, the weight of his crumbling world pressing down on him. And I knew, deep down, he wasn't going to take this quietly. The first sign of retaliation came 2 days later. My bank account flagged an unauthorized attempt to access my funds. Someone had tried to break through my financial security, someone desperate. I locked it down immediately. Then came the calls. Anonymous, threatening, full of venom. Promises of payback. Promises that I'd regret ever messing with him. I knew it was him, even if he didn't say his name. Brandon had always been predictable, but the real surprise came at 3 a.m. when the sound of glass shattering ripped through my house. I was on my feet instantly, heart pounding as I grabbed the bat I kept by my bedside. The security system was blaring, red lights flashing across the walls. I moved quickly, checking the front room, and that's when I saw him, Brandon, wild-eyed, standing in the wreckage of my living room window. He was breathing hard, swaying slightly, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in his hand. His suit was wrinkled, his tie undone, a man barely holding himself together. "What the hell are you doing?" I demanded. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "You ruined my life, you little piece of shit. You did that yourself." I tightened my grip on the bat, staying just out of reach. "Get the hell out of my house, Brandon. Now. You think this is over?" He let out a bitter laugh, staggering forward. "I lost everything because of you. My job, my money, my goddamn family. And whose fault is that?" I snapped. "You lied. You stole. You scammed people. This was always going to catch up with you." His face twisted with rage. "You were supposed to be the loser. You were supposed to be nothing." The words hit me harder than I expected. That was it, wasn't it? The core of everything. Brandon had spent his entire life needing to be better than me. And when he finally had to face the truth, that he wasn't, he snapped. "I was never nothing, Brandon," I said quietly. "You just needed me to be." He lunged. I barely had time to react. He tackled me, knocking the bat from my hands as we crashed into the coffee table. Pain exploded through my ribs, but I fought back, shoving him off. He came at me again, swinging wildly. I dodged the first hit. The second clipped my jaw. But the third, that one I saw coming. I stepped aside, grabbed his arm, and used his own momentum to slam him into the floor. Hard. He groaned, dazed, struggling to push himself up. Sirens. Red and blue lights flashed through the broken window. Someone, probably a neighbor, had called the cops. Brandon looked up at me, realization dawning in his bloodshot eyes. "Don't do this," he whispered. "I'm your brother." I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. "You stopped being my brother a long time ago." The front door burst open, officers swarming in. Brandon barely resisted as they cuffed him, dragging him to his feet. One of the cops turned to me. "You okay, sir?" I nodded. "Yeah, I'm okay." As they led Brandon away, he threw one last look over his shoulder. I expected hatred. I expected fury. But what I saw instead was something I never thought I'd see in him. Defeat. For the first time in his life, Brandon had lost. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one left standing in the shadows. I watched as the patrol car disappeared into the night. Then, for the first time in years, I took a deep breath. No more chains. No more ghosts. No more Brandon. I was finally free.